Snow cut sideways across the jagged spine of Wildcat Mountain that October afternoon in 1863. Each gust a living blade that sliced through wool and skin with equal cruelty. Eva Hartman dragged herself upward through drifts that swallowed her legs past the knee, her boots punching through the frozen crust and sending cascades of powder tumbling toward the ravine's black mouth far below. The world had narrowed to white chaos, and the desperate rhythm of her own breathing ragged gasps that tore at her throat with each step. Against her chest, strapped beneath a threadbare woolen shawl that had once been her grandmother's, so the newborn radiated a warmth so fragile, it frightened her more than the pursuing guns. 4 children clung to her skirts like sailors to a sinking ship. Lena, 9 years old, her narrow face carved from some stubborn Baltic stone that refused to acknowledge defeat, even as her lips turned blue. Fritz, 7, with his father's jaw locked tight against the howling wind and eyes that had stopped looking like a child's eyes months ago. Carl, 5, stumbling every third step and crying softly, the sound almost lost in the storm. And Marta, barely 4 years old, her tiny fingers stripped bare where the mittens had torn completely away, the skin going the color of old bone. The wind screamed across naked rock, with a sound like the mountain itself was dying. Eva's lungs felt scraped raw with each inhalation, as though she were breathing broken glass instead of air. Her legs trembled so violently, she wondered if the next step would be the one where they simply gave out entirely, where she and all 5 children would tumble backward into that white oblivion that seemed to reach up hungrily from below. Behind them, perhaps half a mile down the slope, the distance had become impossible to judge. Rifle shots cracked through the storm's sharp reports that punched through the wind's constant roar like stones thrown through water. Men with guns and rope and murder in their hearts. Men who would not stop, not for storm or darkness or any appeal to mercy, because there was no mercy left in Granite Pass for a German widow accused of theft and arson and consorting with savages. From the tree line ahead, where the pines grew so thick and dark, they seemed to absorb what little light remained. A shadow materialized through the chaos of driving snow. A bay horse emerged, moving with the steady confidence of an animal born to this brutal country, and astride it sat a man who seemed carved from the same unforgiving stone as the mountain itself. He wore winter buckskin, dark with accumulated snow, intricate quill work barely visible beneath the layers of ice. And a wrapped war bonnet was lashed to his pack, its eagle feathers protected beneath a fold of buffalo hide. His face remained perfectly still, dark eyes sweeping across the desperate tableau in one long measuring assessment, the woman's shaking legs, the youngest child's bare and bleeding fingers, the hollow-eyed boys whose faces had turned the gray of old ash. Eva Hartman jerked to a halt, her boots skidding on hidden ice beneath the powder. Her hand fumbled beneath the shawl with fingers so numb they barely obeyed her commands, emerging at last with a small revolver, the kind of cheap weapon sold to widows and shopkeepers for protection that rarely worked when truly needed. The metal was so viciously cold, it branded her palm even through what remained of her glove. She tried to raise the weapon to steady her aim on the stranger who had appeared from nowhere, but the barrel wavered wildly in her trembling grip. Her breath tore from her throat in ragged white clouds that the wind stole away before they could fully form. The warrior did not draw a weapon in response. He did not reach for the rifle slung across his broad back or the knife that hung at his belt. Instead, he watched the children, first studying each small face, with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what he was seeing, and then turned his gaze to her. His expression remained calm and level, in a way that seemed utterly impossible amid this chaos of shrieking wind and driving snow and imminent death. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, each word shaped with deliberate precision in English that carried the careful cadence of someone who had learned the language through long practice rather than birth. There was no threat in his tone, no demand, only a simple statement of fact. "Come with me, please." Eva's finger trembled against the trigger. The warrior waited with the patience of stone itself, his horse standing perfectly still despite the wind that threatened to knock them all from the mountainside. Behind them, the dark figures of the posse spread across the lower slope like a stain seeping through white cloth. Ahead, the blizzard thickened into an impenetrable wall where sky and stone dissolved into one howling void. She looked down at her children, at Lana trying so hard to be brave, at Fritz's jaw clenched against more than cold, at Carl's wide, frightened eyes, at Marta's blue lips forming words that made no sound. She looked at the baby's face, barely visible within the cocoon of fabric against her chest. Then she looked back at the Lakota warrior who had somehow found them in this wilderness of white death, and offered them a choice between one stranger and certain freezing. The wind shrieked. The mountain shook with its fury. And Ava Hartman, who had crossed an ocean and buried a husband and survived more than any woman should have to survive, made a choice. She lowered the gun. 3 days earlier, Granite Pass had crouched in dust and early frost, like a wounded animal too stubborn to die. A mining town wedged brutally between the vast emptiness of prairie to the east and the dark wall of timber that marked the mountain foothills to the west. It was a place built entirely on greed and held together solely by fear. A one muddy street lined with rough-cut buildings that leaned against each other for support. Pike Consolidated's tall assay office looming over everything. Like a landlord counting coins, and Widow Smith's boarding house sagging against the livery stable as though too exhausted to stand alone. Eva had risen before dawn that morning, as she did every morning to light the kitchen stove. Her hands were red and cracked from harsh lye soap permanently stained with the evidence of endless labor. Her back had developed a permanent bend from carrying water and scrubbing floors on her knees. She cooked and laundered at the boarding house to pay off the crushing mountain of debts her husband had supposedly left when he died 18 months earlier. The official story was bandits in a narrow gorge, common enough in this lawless territory that few questioned it. They had brought his body back draped over his own horse, and the marshal had looked at her with eyes that slid away too quickly when she asked for details, and she had buried him in the cemetery on the hill, with a wooden cross that bore his name and nothing more, because there was no money for stone. But sometimes, late at night when sleep refused to come, and the baby fussed in his crate, and the wind found every gap in the attic walls, Eva remembered things that didn't fit the official story. She remembered how her husband Thomas had refused to sell their small grazing lease to Pike Consolidated 3 times in the month before he died. She remembered the threatening letters that had arrived written in crude block print, warning him that stubborn men often met unfortunate ends in wild country. She remembered the way Rusty Joe, the so-called marshal, had showed up at the funeral drunk and whispered something to Hook Hand Harry that made them both laugh. She remembered, and she wondered, and she kept her mouth shut, because what choice did a foreign widow with 5 children have in a town that barely tolerated her existence? Her children slept in one cramped attic room under the eaves, where rain dripped through gaps in the warped shingles and wind whistled through cracks wide enough to see daylight. Lena, the eldest at 9, had inherited her mother's steel spine and her father's stubborn chin, along with a burden of responsibility no child should carry. She scrubbed floors when Widow Smith wasn't watching her small hands, working the stiff brush in tight circles until the water turned black. Fritz, 7 years old, was quiet and watchful, in the way of children who have learned that speaking draws attention, and attention brings trouble. He slipped out after dark to check the rabbit snares he had hidden in the scrub beyond town. And more than once his catches had been the only meat they'd eaten that week. Carl, only 5, clung to his older siblings with eyes too wide and frightened for his age, and Marta, barely 4, still cried when she was hungry, which was most of the time. The baby born 3 months earlier in the freezing attic, with only Widow Smith's grudging assistance and a bottle of whiskey for pain, slept in a wooden crate lined with rags. Eva had not yet named him. To name him would be to accept that this grinding poverty, this slow starvation of body and spirit, was permanent and inescapable. To name him would be to admit that there was no escape from Granite Pass, no hope of anything better than scrubbing other people's floors until her back finally broke, or her lungs filled with the same consumption that killed so many women in their 30s. Granite Pass tolerated Eva Hartmann because she worked harder than anyone else and charged less than they deserved to pay. She was foreign, her German accent still thick and heavy, despite nearly a decade in America. And that marked her as different as suspect, as someone who didn't quite belong. But cheap labor counted for more than bloodline in a place where silver was king, and human life was merely another negotiable commodity. So they let her stay and work and keep her mouth shut, and tried not to think too hard about what it meant that Pike Consolidated seemed to own absolutely everything and everyone in the territory. That particular afternoon, the first truly cold afternoon of October, when frost had begun to silver the grass each morning and the aspens on the mountainside had turned to gold, 3 Lakota riders appeared at the far end of Granite Pass's main street. They led pack horses loaded with winter hides, prime elk and glossy deer, and beaver pelts so fine they would fetch excellent prices from the eastern traders who came through buying for the St. Louis markets. The town went abruptly and completely quiet. Men on the boardwalk stopped mid-conversation to stare with naked hostility. Someone spat brown tobacco juice into the mud and muttered, "Prairie rats," just loud enough for the words to carry across the rutted street. Another man made an elaborate show of checking his rifle, though he didn't quite raise it to his shoulder. Not yet. Not while there were witnesses who might remember. The lead rider was a man Eva guessed to be somewhere in his late 20s, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid economy of someone who had learned through hard experience to conserve every ounce of strength for when it truly mattered. He wore plain buckskin with no ornamentation, no war paint, no war bonnet, just a working man who had come to trade honestly for fair value. But the town saw only the copper color of his skin and the long black hair tied back with a simple strip of leather, and the old burn scar that curved from his collarbone toward his jaw, like a permanent brand marking violence, survived. Inside the general store, where Eva had gone to weigh out beans for Widow Smith's pantry, the air hung thick with the mingled smells of flour dust and harsh tobacco, and the sour tang of too many unwashed bodies crowded into too small a space. The Lakota man Eva would later learn his name was Chaska, which meant eldest son in his language, set a carefully arranged bundle of prime pelts on the scarred wooden counter, and waited in patient silence while the storekeeper, a gray-haired man named Tolliver, inspected them with exaggerated and insulting slowness. Tolliver lifted each pelt individually to the lamplight, squinting theatrically as though searching for flaws that clearly did not exist, taking his time because he could, because in this place, a white storekeeper's time was worth more than a Lakota hunter's dignity. Eva stood near the cast-iron scales, her hands moving on pure habit as she scooped beans into a cloth sack, weighing and counting. While her exhausted mind performed its own calculations, how many pennies remained, how many days until the next impossible rent payment came due, how long the beans would last if she rationed them carefully enough. The drunk called Rusty Joe, wearing his tarnished badge and reeking of whiskey even at midday, shouldered into Chaska from directly behind with deliberate force. Hard enough to send the Lakota man stumbling forward against the counter's edge. The carefully arranged pelts slid and scattered across the dirty floor like leaves in wind. "Watch where you stand, boy," Rusty Joe drawled with elaborate menace, grinning to reveal teeth stained dark brown from years of chewing tobacco. "You block the whole damn aisle with your red hide, taking up decent white men's space." Chaska bent slowly and began gathering the scattered pelts with movements that wasted no energy. His hand stayed conspicuously far from the knife sheathed at his belt. His face remained perfectly still and expressionless, revealing absolutely nothing of whatever thoughts moved behind those dark eyes. He straightened with the same measured care, arranged the pelts back on the counter with meticulous precision, and stepped aside without speaking a single word in response to the provocation. Eva watched this tense exchange from her position across the narrow store, and something in her chest tightened with recognition. She saw exactly what Chaska was doing, and the way he counted the men present in that brief moment, noted which ones carried visible weapons, calculated with cold precision the probable cost of defending his dignity against deliberate insult. She recognized that internal calculation because she performed an identical assessment every single day of her grinding existence. When to speak and when to stay silent. When to meet eyes and when to look at the floor. When to stand your ground and when survival meant swallowing your pride and walking away. Their eyes met for one brief instant across the cramped hostile space. His were dark and utterly unreadable, revealing nothing. Hers were simply tired beyond measure. Neither spoke. The moment passed. Then Tolliver muttered something dismissive about fair trade for your kind, and counted out coins with maddening, insulting slowness, and Chaska took his meager payment and left without protest. Eva finished weighing the beans and carried them back to the boarding house, where the afternoon stretched ahead in its usual pattern of endless labor washing linens in water so cold her hands went numb. Hauling buckets from the well until her shoulders screamed scrubbing floors while the baby cried in his crate upstairs, and she tried not to think about all the things she was failing to provide for her children. High on the hill above the assay office, well past the company bunkhouse, where exhausted miners slept 12 men to a room on straw pallets that stank of sweat and sickness, Gideon Pike sat in his spacious private office and counted money that did not belong to him. He was a thick man gone to fat from years spent behind a desk, while other men dug and bled and died for his profit. His pale hands had never held a shovel or swung a pick. His face had taken on the pasty, unhealthy texture of something that lived perpetually underground away from honest sunlight. Pike ran Granite Pass exactly the way a feudal lord ran his personal fiefdom. Every soul in town worked for him, either directly or indirectly, through chains of debt and dependence. And those few who dared refuse were driven out or quietly buried in unmarked graves, where no questions would ever be asked. He owned the mine and the assay office and most of the buildings that lined the muddy street. He owned the town's one lawyer and its excuse for a marshal. He owned debts and liens and mortgages on property that men thought they owned free and clear until the day Pike decided otherwise. His enormous desk held 2 sets of ledgers. The first was neat organized and entirely public designed, specifically to pass casual inspection by investors or territorial auditors who might come asking questions. It showed modest but reasonable wages, plausible ore yields, and tidy records of silver shipments sent east to the railroad barons who had funded the mine's initial expansion. The second ledger was considerably heavier, bound in cracked leather that had darkened with age, and handling its pages dense with blotted ink corrections and entries written in crude cipher. This one revealed the brutal truth that Pike would kill to keep hidden. Ore smuggled past the official assays. Double shipments recorded only in coded telegraph receipts. Substantial bribes paid regularly to territorial officials and corrupt judges who looked the other way. And a particularly disturbing column marked simply guardianship fees payments made to unscrupulous Eastern orphanages in exchange for signed contracts transferring children westward as so-called apprentice labor. A legal fiction that allowed Pike to work them in the deepest, most dangerous tunnels until they broke from injury, sickened from the poisoned air, or simply died and were buried quietly without ceremony or record. Pike kept this private ledger and all its supporting telegraph receipts locked in a small iron safe concealed behind a false cabinet panel in the wall behind his desk. In all of Granite Pass, only 2 men had ever glimpsed its damning contents: Hookhand Harry, his lean and dangerous foreman, who had lost his left hand years ago in a mining accident, and now wore a wickedly curved iron hook strapped to the stump, and Rusty Joe, who performed Pike's cruelest and most illegal work in direct exchange for whiskey money and a warm bed in winter. That evening, as the sun set, in a cold blaze of orange and deep purple that promised frost before morning, Eva stood at the kitchen window, mechanically washing dishes in water so numbingly frigid that her knuckles ached and turned fish-belly white. Through the wavy glass, she watched Chaska and the other Lakota hunters preparing to depart town, tying down their packs and checking their horses with the painstaking attention of men who understood that a single loose strap or an unnoticed limp could easily mean death in the unforgiving wilderness. One of the miners, emboldened by an afternoon of steady drinking, threw a jagged stone at the lead pack horse. The stone missed its target by several feet, clattering harmlessly off a hitching post. But the hostile message behind the gesture was unmistakable. Chaska did not visibly react. He simply swung into his saddle with practiced grace and rode calmly into the gathering darkness, heading west toward the mountains. Eva stood watching until he and his companions disappeared completely into the dark line of pines. And she found herself wondering, with genuine curiosity, what it must cost a man to swallow that much concentrated anger and deliberate insult day after day, without eventually choking on the accumulated bitterness of it. She did not know, could not possibly have known, that in exactly 3 days, that same stoic man would save her life and the lives of all her children. Fritz Hartmann had always been far too clever and dangerously too curious for his own good, a combination his mother had warned him about repeatedly. Though her warnings seemed to have had little effect. On the 4th night of that week, long after Widow Smith had loudly bolted her door, and the boarding house's resident miners had stumbled off to their rooms in various advanced stages of drunkenness, Fritz slipped from the cramped attic and down the narrow back stairs, moving on completely bare feet that made no sound whatsoever on the worn wooden steps. The boards were cold enough to ache against his soles, but bare feet were silent, and silence was everything. When you were somewhere you shouldn't be. He told himself with the casual dishonesty that came naturally to 7-year-old boys that he was only looking for food. Pike's men always left generous scraps after their late evening meetings, sometimes half-eaten biscuits, occasionally even cold bacon or a piece of cheese. But the deeper truth, the one Fritz wouldn't have admitted even to himself, was more complicated. He genuinely enjoyed exploring the hidden parts of the world that adults mistakenly thought children should not see. He liked knowing things. He liked possessing secrets. There was a kind of power in it, a small rebellion against the helplessness of being young and poor and foreign, in a town that barely tolerated their existence. He climbed the exterior stairs to Pike's office above the assay building, with exaggerated care testing each step thoroughly before committing his full weight, moving in the careful crouch of someone trying to make themselves as small and unnoticeable as possible. The heavy door at the top stood slightly ajar, warm lamplight spilling out into the dark hallway in a tempting golden wedge. Voices drifted out clearly, Pike's low rumble like distant thunder rolling across summer prairie, Rusty Joe's unpleasant nasal whine, and a third voice that sounded disturbingly like metal scraping slowly across stone. Fritz recognized this last as Hook Hand Harry, whose iron prosthetic made a distinctive clicking sound whenever he gestured for emphasis. Fritz froze at the top of the stairs. Every survival instinct he possessed screamed at him to turn around immediately and flee back down to the relative safety of the kitchen. Instead, drawn by a curiosity that was stronger than his fear, he edged closer to the door with agonizing slowness and peered through the narrow gap between door and frame. Inside the lamplit office, Pike sat behind his massive desk with the heavy leather-bound private ledger spread open before him like some unholy scripture. Hook hand, Harry leaned against the wall near the window, his terrible hook catching the lamplight and throwing grotesque, distorted shadows across the ceiling. Rusty Joe paced restlessly near the iron stove, chewing tobacco and spitting into a dented tin cup with rhythmic regularity. The Eastern investors are getting genuinely nervous, Pike said flatly, tapping the open ledger with one thick, pale finger. His voice carried the bored tone of a man discussing a minor inconvenience rather than systematic fraud. They believe they're owed 10 full percent of this. He jabbed more forcefully at a dense column of numbers. In reality, they receive 6%. The remaining 4% pays you boys generously and keeps this entire town functioning under my control. That, gentlemen, is how empires are built. You skim carefully, but never so much they notice the bleeding. But what happens if they send out a federal auditor? Rusty Joe asked nervously, his voice noticeably tight, with poorly concealed worry. He spat into his cup and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Pike waved one dismissive hand with lordly confidence. They won't dare. I telegraphed them detailed monthly summaries based exclusively on the clean numbers from the public ledger. They see exactly and only what I want them to see. As long as the silver continues flowing steadily eastward and their quarterly dividend checks continue clearing the bank without issue, they have absolutely no reason to ride all the way out to this godforsaken place just to personally count ore cars and interview diseased miners. Harry shifted his weight against the wall, his hook tapping thoughtfully against his belt buckle with a sound like coins dropping. What about that meddling Dr. Schneider's been talking far too openly to some of the sick miners lately? He's saying loudly that the company should be paying for proper medicine and installing better ventilation equipment in the lower shafts. Some of the men are starting to listen. Pike's fleshy face darkened with anger, veins standing out on his forehead. Let the fool talk himself hoarse. No one with any real power listens to a perpetually drunk German who treats filthy Indians for free. If he somehow becomes a genuine problem rather than merely an irritating noise, we'll handle him exactly the same way we handled Hartman last year. Fritz's breath caught painfully in his throat. His heart began pounding so violently he felt certain they would hear it through the walls. Hartman. His father's name. They were talking about his father. That job worked perfectly clean, Harry observed with a note of distinct professional pride. Made it look exactly like bandits caught him alone in the gorge. No inconvenient witnesses, no awkward questions from anyone important. Precisely. Pike agreed with evident satisfaction, leaning back in his expensive chair and lacing his pale fingers across his belly. Hartman refused to sell his grazing lease no matter how much money I offered or how many times I made increasingly generous proposals. So we removed the obstacle. Simple economics. Now his pathetic widow scrubs my floors daily and keeps her foreign mouth shut. That's exactly how you manage difficult people who refuse to see reason. The words hit Fritz like repeated physical blows. His father. They were casually discussing his father's murder the way other men might discuss the weather or the price of grain. The bandits everyone spoke about with such conviction had been a lie from the beginning. Pike had ordered his father killed. Fritz shifted his weight without conscious thought, his young mind desperately trying to process this horrifying knowledge. His elbow accidentally bumped the wooden cabinet beside the door. The sound of wood scraping against wood echoed in the quiet hallway like a gunshot in a canyon. The room fell instantly silent. Then Rusty Joe's boots thundered across the floor. The door flew violently open. A rough hand shot out and grabbed Fritz by the collar, physically yanking him into the lamplight with such force that his feet left the floor entirely. Well, well, well. Rusty Joe drawled with exaggerated menace, his overpowering whiskey breath hot and nauseating on Fritz's frightened face. Look what we've caught here. A sneaking little rat with big ears who listens where he shouldn't. Pike rose very slowly from his chair, his face rapidly turning the unhealthy color of spoiled meat. He reached for the brass-handled cane that leaned within easy reach against his desk, an implement that served as much as weapon as walking aid, and everyone in town knew it. What exactly did you hear, boy? His voice was dangerously soft. Fritz desperately tried to twist free from Rusty Joe's iron grip, but it was utterly hopeless. Nothing, sir, I swear. I was just hungry and looking for liars. Pike interrupted, coldly advancing with the cane raised. Always get the strap first. Then afterward we discussed truth and consequences. He raised the heavy cane high. Downstairs in the dining room, Eva was on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor with rhythmic strokes, her aching back screaming protest. She heard Fritz cry out sharply, a frightened, hurt yelp that cut through the floorboards and stabbed directly into her heart. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She dropped the brush with a clatter, scrambled to her feet, and ran for the stairs, her skirts flying wildly, her boots pounding heavily on the wooden risers. She crashed through Pike's office door just as he swung the heavy cane toward Fritz's unprotected back. She didn't pause, even for an instant. She threw her entire body between them with the desperate force of a mother protecting her young. The cane cracked across her left shoulder, with a sound exactly like a thick branch, snapping the impact, sending lightning bolts of pure agony down her entire side. She gasped, her vision filling with stars, but she kept her feet and clutched Fritz against her chest with her good arm. The force of her collision sent Pike stumbling awkwardly backward. The heavy private ledger slid off the desk's edge and hit the floor with a solid, meaty thud. Papers spilled wildly from the open safe behind Pike's chair, telegraph receipts, covered in numbers, contracts bearing official seals, and red wax, a substantial bundle of crisp banknotes bound with string. Eva's wicker laundry basket sat on the corner of Pike's desk, half filled with shirts she had collected from his private quarters earlier that evening. Without understanding why, driven by desperate instinct to grab something, anything that might serve as evidence or leverage or a precious bargaining chip, she frantically scooped up the loose papers and the fallen ledger, cramming them into the basket beneath the concealing shirts. Rusty Joe yanked his revolver from its worn holster. The hammer clicked back with a sound that seemed to fill the entire room. He pointed the weapon directly at Eva's head, his finger already tightening on the trigger. A shadow filled the doorway. Chaska stood there, one hand resting near the rifle slung across his back. He had returned to collect the final payment Tolliver had conveniently forgotten to include earlier. He had heard the shouting from the street. "The boy leaves," Chaska said quietly, his English slow and deliberate. "No one needs to die over bread." His tone was not threatening. It was simply factual. But his presence, solid-armed, utterly calm, shifted the balance in the room. The pause that followed stretched long enough for reason to claw its way back through rage and fear. Rusty Joe didn't lower his gun, but his finger eased back from the trigger. Pike's face stayed red veins standing out, but he didn't give the order to fire. Eva didn't wait for the spell to break. She yanked Fritz toward the door, the basket clutched against her hip pain, screaming through her shoulder. She heard Pike shouting behind her, something about theft and lies and arrest. But she was already clattering down the stairs out the back door into the frozen night. She ran all the way to the boarding house, her breath tearing in her lungs. She gathered the sleeping children from the attic and locked the flimsy door. Her hands shook as she set the basket on Lena's cot and pulled back the shirts. The ledger, the papers, proof of crimes she didn't yet fully understand. That night, Widow Smith's boarding house burned to the ground. Eva woke to the overwhelming smell of smoke and the terrible crackling sound of hungry flames. Heat pressed against the attic door like something alive trying to force its way in. She threw a soaking wet blanket over the baby, shoved Lena toward the small window, hauled Carl and Marta after. Fritz stumbled behind, coughing so hard he could barely stand. The main staircase had collapsed into flaming wreckage, but there was a narrow service ladder leading down to the kitchen. Eva pushed the terrified children through the gap one by one, the heat scorching her lungs. Timber groaned overhead. The roof was seconds from collapse. They burst out the back just as the structure collapsed inward with a roar. Eva dragged them across the frozen yard into the alley where they collapsed against the neighboring building, gasping. Widow Smith didn't come out. Her body was found the next morning burned beyond recognition. By dawn, half the town stood in the ashes. Rusty Joe, reeking of lamp oil, told the crowd the fire was arson set by a foreign widow who had stolen from Pike and tried to destroy evidence. He said Eva had attacked Pike without provocation, then fled with help from a savage accomplice. The crowd muttered and nodded. Foreigners, Indians, it all made sense. Emil Schneider heard the accusations from his clinic window and knew they were lies. He found Eva and the children hiding behind his building and hustled them into his tool shed. By candlelight, Emil opened the basket. He saw the ledger, the telegraphs, and his face went pale. This is more than fraud. This shows he's robbing federal investors. And these contracts, he's buying children. He sketched a map on a prescription pad, handshaking. There's an old Lakota trail over Wildcat Mountain. Follow it to Bear Creek. A deputy marshal is there now. Get this to him. It's your only chance. Eva stared at the map. 2 days on foot with 5 children. Winter coming. But staying meant death. She folded the map, tucked the ledger under her coat, gathered the children. They slipped out through Emil's back gate before dawn. Behind them, Granite Pass woke to smoke and the promise of a hunt. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, vast and merciless, under a pale sky. Wind cut across open ground, with nothing to stop it driving grit into their faces, stealing warmth from their bodies with every gust. Eva carried the baby pressed against her chest, the ledger wrapped in rags against her belly. Lena walked beside her in grim silence. Fritz and Carl stumbled behind. Marta clung to Lena's hand, already whimpering. By midday, they reached a narrow creek where ice had formed along the edges in jagged sheets. Eva tested it with her boot. It cracked, but held. She sent Lena across first, then Fritz, then Carl. When Marta stepped onto the ice, it gave way, with a sharp crack. The little girl plunged through to her thighs, gasping. Eva lunged forward. Icy water flooded over her ankles, so cold it felt like fire burning her flesh. She hauled Marta out strips off the wet stockings, rubbed the child's legs desperately. She wrapped Marta in her own shawl, leaving herself with only a thin jacket. The delay cost them an hour. By the time they reached the timber, the sun was sinking and the temperature dropping fast. Back in Granite Pass, Pike stared at the empty safe. If those papers reached a federal officer, they would show systematic fraud and child slavery. The investors might overlook creative accounting, but the territorial governor couldn't ignore that. Pike's hands shook as he poured whiskey and drained it. Then he slammed the glass down and shouted for Harry. Within the hour, Harry rode out with 5 armed men. Pike's orders were simple. Bring back the widow, the ledger, every paper. Kill anyone who interfered. If the children slowed them down, leave them. Winter would finish it. Rusty Joe sent telegrams describing Eva as an arsonist who fled with a savage accomplice. The bounty would bring every drifter within 50 miles. At the Lakota winter camp, an elder named Mongwao listened to Emil's breathless report. Pike was stirring the town against the Lakota, blaming the fire on Indian treachery. "There's a woman," Emil said. "She carries a book that could destroy Pike. If it reaches the marshal, maybe this valley can breathe." Mongwao considered. Pike's hold had poisoned everything. If the book could break him, it was worth the risk. Chaska volunteered. "If that book hangs him, maybe our horses and their cattle both find grass without blood." Mongwao nodded once. Chaska prepared quickly checked weapons, filled saddlebags with pemmican. He swung onto his bay and rode alone into the mountains. The storm was building. By late afternoon, Eva and the children were deep in timber, where light faded early. Snow began light at first, then heavier. The baby whimpered. Marta shivered. Then Fritz stopped. Mama, look. Tracks patterned the snow, large paw prints. Wolves. Eva's throat tightened. She saw them, shadows moving between trees just out of sight. Eva pulled out the small revolver. It felt tiny, useless. She turned in circles, trying to watch every shadow. The baby began to cry. A rifle shot cracked. One wolf yelped and vanished. The rest scattered. Chaska rode out of the trees. He dismounted, tore a pitchy branch from a dead pine, lit it from his lantern. Flames roared up. The wolves retreated. Eva swung the revolver toward him, hands shaking. Stay back. Chaska kept his hands visible. He studied the children, blue lips, raw knuckles, the ledger-shaped bulge under Eva's shawl. Men with guns ride behind you. Town says you burned women, ran with a savage. They won't listen. Blizzard comes. You won't cross the pass alone. She heard only truth. The gun barrel dipped. Why help us? Emil asked. And the man chasing you hurts my people too. Enemy of my enemy, that's reason enough. It was the most honest answer she'd ever heard. That made it easier to trust. He showed her how to bind the baby tighter, how to sit Marta on the saddle, how the boys should hold the horse's tail. They moved in silence along a frozen river, up a narrow ravine, where branches dumped powder on their necks. On an exposed hillside, a bullet smacked rock near Chaska's knee. Harry's riders had spotted them. Chaska swung them behind a boulder, laid prone with his carbine. He passed the cartridge belt to Fritz. When I fire, hand me another. Quick but careful. The rifle cracked. Fritz fumbled with a fresh round. Eva helped guide it. Their hands touched. Their faces were close, breath a mingling, focused on the rhythm fire, reload fire. Chaska shot low, kicking up snow and rock. Horses reared. By the time Harry's men regrouped, the wind had thickened to white curtain. Chaska led them into dense timber. He knew this country. There was an old silver mine 2 miles ahead. Only shelter for miles. They pushed through forest as night fell. The baby had stopped crying, which worried Eva more than the crying had. The mine mouth appeared suddenly. Smoke curled from within. Someone was already inside. Eva and Chaska exchanged a look. He slid his rifle from its sheath. Together they approached. Inside, a small fire burned. Seated around it, a Lakota woman with 2 children and a thin white man with haunted eyes. Eva recognized him. Jack Hartman, her dead husband's younger brother. Jack rose slowly, hand drifting to his revolver. He stared at Eva, then the children, then Chaska. His jaw worked. Jack, Eva said, voice flat. What are you doing here? The Lakota woman Winona spoke first in halting English. He brought food. Said bad men chase him too. Jack's voice came out rough. Eva, God, I hoped you'd make it but didn't believe. He stopped, swallowed. I need to tell you something. About Thomas. About how he really died. Eva's blood turned to ice. Bandits. Everyone said bandits. Jack shook his head. That's what they wanted people to believe. Pike ordered it. Thomas wouldn't sell his grazing lease. Pike wanted the land. Thomas refused 3 times. So Pike sent men to ambush him in Crowfoot Gorge. I was driving the wagon that day. I saw it. Silence swallowed all sound. Eva couldn't breathe. You were there, she whispered. You watched them murder him and said nothing. I was terrified. Pike owns everything, the law, the land. If I'd spoken up, I'd have ended in the same grave. So I kept my head down, took his coin. But the guilt, his voice broke. I couldn't live with it. So I started copying things. Telegraphs, contracts. He pulled papers from his coat. I've been stealing his documents for 6 months. Eva took them slowly, knelt by the fire, spread them beside the light. Lena crowded close, The dates matched the ledger exactly. Telegraph payment orders, orphanage contracts. And there her husband's name beside lease termination enforced. Oct 14, 1862, the date Thomas died. The truth crashed over her. Her husband's death wasn't random. The debts were engineered. The fire was erasure. Everything traced back to Pike's greed and Jack's cowardice. "You let me believe it was bad luck," she said, voice colder than the wind outside. "You let me break myself paying debts built on murder. You watched me scrub floors for the man who killed him." "I know," Jack whispered. "Sorry isn't enough, but I'm trying to make it right. These papers with what you took together, it's enough to hang him." Fritz spoke up, voice sharp. "It doesn't bring Papa back." "No," Jack said quietly. "Nothing can." Before the confrontation could spiral, the mountain interrupted. A deep roar rolled down from above. The ground shuddered. Dust sifted from the timbers. Chaska was already moving, grabbing children, pulling them deeper. Avalanche. Outside, a massive slab of snow broke free and slammed down across the ledge, burying the entrance halfway. The fire flickered. When the rumble faded, they were left in near darkness, the entrance half-blocked air thick with dust. The avalanche had cut off retreat and left a clear trail for Harry to follow. The tunnels twisted deeper, supported by timbers so old the wood had turned black. Rusted ore carts sat half-buried. Every step was treacherous. Moving the children through darkness was agonizingly slow. Chaska led with a torch, testing each plank. Eva followed, carrying the baby. Jack and Winona brought up the rear. At a junction, wooden planks spanned a shaft, dropping into blackness. Carl stepped onto the first plank. It cracked. His foot punched through. He dropped with a shriek, legs kicking over the void. Chaska dived, caught Carl's coat with his right hand, dragged him back. The effort tore something in his left shoulder, the old burn-scarred one. Pain shot down his arm. He bit down on a gasp, but Eva saw his face go pale, saw him cradle the arm. From then on, he couldn't lift it without stabbing pain. They found a side chamber where the ceiling seemed stable. Jack produced a small cache, flour, salt, jerked venison. Pitifully little for 11 people. They divided it, children first, then everyone else split what remained. During the night, the temperature plummeted. They huddled together, but it wasn't enough. The baby began to shiver violently, lips turning blue. Eva wrapped him in everything, but the shivering worsened. Chaska gestured to a narrow niche in the rock. "Bring him. Body heat. Better than blankets." She carried the baby to the niche. Chaska eased down on one side, injured arm against his chest. Eva sat on the other. They pressed close, the baby between them. Their shoulders touched. Their breathing slowed, began to match. The baby's shivering gradually subsided. Neither spoke. The intimacy was forced by need, yet both felt the weight of it, the warmth of another body, the rhythm of another heart, the strange comfort of not being alone. Outside, Harry reached the avalanche debris. He studied the churned snow. Too many tracks to be just the widow. Someone else was with them. His 5 men weren't enough if they were armed and dug in. He turned his horse and rode back. In Granite Pass, Pike listened to Harry's report. The fugitives were cornered. But if he moved too slow, they might find another exit. "Gather everyone, every man who can hold a gun. We bury the whole mountain." He assembled a larger force, Harry Rusty Joe company guards, townsmen lured by bounty. They loaded crates onto mules, not dynamite, but black powder-blasting kegs, crude explosive that had been sitting too long. The plan: collapse the entrance with black powder, burn what survives, blame it on renegade Lakota. In the mine, Jack explored deeper tunnels by torchlight. He found an old ventilation shaft angling up. Narrow, partially blocked, but climbable. It should open on the ridge above the entrance. From up there, someone might see attackers coming, might even turn Pike's powder against him. Chaska and Jack exchanged a look. Neither trusted the other. But both understood their choices had narrowed. They gathered rope, the small keg of black powder Jack had stolen, and a torch. Then they began to climb. Pike's enlarged posse struggled up Wildcat Mountain as the storm transformed into a blizzard. Wind shrieks across rock. Visibility drops to arm's length. Men curse and stumble. By the time they reach the mine, they're exhausted, frostbitten, vicious. Rusty Joe shouts orders. Build a wall, block them in. Men pile snow and rock in a semicircle. They build a fire in the lee. Smoke will choke them, Harry says, or they'll run and we'll pick 'em off. Inside, smoke coils along the ceiling. Ava tears strips from her skirt, soaks them, ties them over the children's faces. It helps, but not enough. Chaska and Jack crawl up the ventilation shaft in near darkness. The shaft is steep walls, slick with ice. Chaska climbs mostly with his right arm, injured shoulder sending jolts of agony. Jack follows the powder keg strapped to his back. Finally, they emerge onto a knife-edge ridge. Wind tries to peel them off. They drop flat and crawl. Then the cornice cracks beneath Jack. A sheet of snow shears away. Jack slides backward, scrabbling, finding only powder. Chaska slams his boots into a crack and lunges for the rope. His left arm is useless. He grabs with his right, taking Jack's full weight. Pain explodes through his shoulder. He feels something tear, feels blood soak his shirt. He hauls. Inch by inch, he drags Jack back. They collapse side by side, faces white. You could have let me fall, Jack says. Maybe. But then I carry the powder myself. Grim humor, but both recognize the truth out here. They need each other. Below, Harry trudges toward the mine entrance, carrying a keg of black powder. He wedges it between the timbers. This isn't neat, modern explosive. This is crude blasting powder, temperamental, dangerous. He pulls out a length of slow-burning fuse. He strikes a match. The flame gutters, but catches. Inside, Eva watches through a crack. She sees the match flare, sees Harry with the fuse. She remembers Jack's mirror. She scrambles back, finds it, angles it toward the light, and flashes it toward the ridge, 3 quick flashes. Danger. Act now. On the ridge, Chaska squints through snow and catches the glint. He sees Harry below, crouched over something. The fuse. He can't shoot the powder without setting it off. But he can shoot the fuse. He raises his rifle, braces it with his good arm, waits for the snow to clear. Harry straightens, holding the lit fuse. Chaska fires. The bullet snaps the fuse in 2. The severed end tumbles into snow and goes out. The powder sits inert. Harry curses, lunges after the fuse, but a small slide knocks him sideways. His feet go out. He slides down and disappears over the edge with a shout cut short. His hook flashes once before vanishing. The failed blast shakes Pike's men. They hunker, lower eyes darting to the invisible ridge. Smoke thickens inside. Emil warns that if they keep the fire, they'll suffocate. If they put it out, they'll freeze. They're out of time. Jack explores deeper and finds an old ore cart on rusted track. The track angles down toward the entrance. If someone could reach it from the ridge and kick it loose, gravity would send it crashing into Pike's camp. But there's no one left. Jack's hands shake too badly. Chaska's shoulder is half useless. That leaves Eva. She looks at her children. She's brought them this far. She won't let Pike win. I'll go. Mama, no. Lena cries. Yes. She straps the baby against her chest, ties rope around her waist, hands the other end to Fritz. Hold this. Don't let go. She follows Chaska back up the shaft muscles, screaming. They emerge onto the ridge. Wind claws at them. They crawl toward the ore cart wedged against the track's end by ice and rust. They reach it. Ava and Chaska lean into it together. The metal is frozen solid. The cart weighs over 1,000 pounds iron and wood and decades of accumulated rust, fighting every inch. It doesn't budge. Harder! Chaska gasps. They shove. The cart jerks. Its iron edge catches Eva's skirt and yanks. She pitches forward. The rope snaps taut, stopping her fall, but she dangles half over the drop baby crushed between her and the cart. Chaska rams his shoulder, the torn, bleeding one, against the cart to stop it rolling over her. The pain is blinding, a white-hot spike driven through muscle and bone. His vision goes dark. His knees buckle. He can feel the muscle tearing further, can taste copper in his mouth from biting his tongue, can feel his consciousness threatening to slip away entirely. Their faces are inches apart. The baby makes distressed sounds between them. On 3. Chaska forces out through teeth clenched so hard his jaw aches. 3. Ava gasps. They shove with everything left, every ounce of strength, every last reserve of will. The cart breaks free with a shriek of tortured metal scraping against rust. It rattles down the track, gathering terrifying momentum, then launches off the end. 1,000 pounds of iron and wood tumbling through space with the momentum of a falling boulder. It crashes into Pike's barricade far below with the force of divine judgment. The impact is devastating. The cart smashes completely through the snow wall, scattering men like toys. Rusty Joe vanishes beneath a cascade of snow and timber. 2 others are knocked flat, one clearly not moving. The fire scatters in an explosion of embers that ignite anything flammable. At that precise moment, Mongguao and 6 Lakota warriors summoned by Emil, traveling storm trails, only they know, explode from the trees on the camp's flank. They fire from cover, not charging, but using terrain and surprise. The fight is short, brutal, human. No heroics. Chaska uses his remaining strength for careful shots from the ridge. The warriors use chaos and storm. Most of Pike's men throw down weapons and run, more afraid of freezing than losing bounty. In the churned snow, Pike lies on his back. The cart struck him, glancing, shattering his leg, pinning his arm. He stares up at gun barrels held by Lakota warriors, ranchers, and one exhausted widow. Mongguao's knife is half drawn. Our dead fill these hills because of him. Let the snow drink his blood. Ava steps between blade and target. If you kill him here, his friends call it savage murder and use it to drive your people out. But if he stands trial with these ledgers, the law hangs him. His crimes get written in records that can't be burned. Mongguao considers, then sheathes the knife. Your law has failed my people many times, but if you make it fail him instead, I'll wait. Emil and Abe arrive with ranchers having followed tracks. Emil carries statements from sick miners. Abe brings word that Eastern investors have sent a company agent and deputy marshal to Bear Creek. Some of Pike's surviving men, seeing the noose tightening, volunteer to testify. They confirm Pike's orders. Inside, Chaska sags against the wall. Emil cuts away the buckskin. Beneath is not only the fresh tear, but a map of old scars, burns, bullets, knives. Emil pours whiskey on the wound. It burns. He threads a needle and begins stitching. No ether, no laudanum. Chaska bites down on leather. His muscles lock with each pull of thread. Eva kneels beside him, holds his wrist so he doesn't tear the stitches. Her fingers rest on his forearm, feeling the tremor. At one point he loses the leather and a groan escapes. She leans closer, other hand on his good shoulder. Their eyes lock. Hers see the scars and understand. His see the same understanding in her. Nothing is said. Nothing needs to be. Something shifts between them, not romance yet, but the foundation of trust. Spring came slowly to Wildcat Mountain, melting snow revealing winter's casualties. At Bear Creek, a courtroom was assembled in the saloon. A deputy marshal sat at the head table, badge gleaming. Beside him, a territorial judge. Next to them, a railroad claims agent holding Pike's ledgers. Pike had stolen from men powerful enough to demand real justice. Ava testified, first voice steady, describing the night she took the ledger, the fire, the flight across the mountain. She told truth and let it stand. Jack testified, next, confession flat and exhausted. He described the ambush in detail, presented his stolen documents. Emil presented medical records and statements. Several of Pike's former guards confirmed the fraud and violence. Mungguao and Chaska sat at the back. They spoke no testimony, but their presence pressed on the proceedings. The defense attacked credibility, but the numbers didn't care about accent or skin. The agent decoded the ledgers, showing exactly where Pike skimmed silver. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours. Guilty, all counts. Pike didn't fall because he was cruel to miners or Indians. He fell because he robbed men richer than himself. The judge also voided Pike's fraudulent land claims. Abe's pasture was returned. The Lakota Winter Range was recognized under treaty. Ava was offered work of managing the school kitchen and given a cabin. It was sturdy with a real stove and glass windows. The town's matrons still whispered, but they needed her cooking. The relationship between Eva and Chaska wasn't discussed publicly. Both understood that open affection would invite violence. But what had grown between them refused to be entirely hidden. One afternoon in late spring, when the river ran high and meadows were thick with flowers, Chaska prepared to ride north with Mungguao's band. Tradition demanded it, the people must follow game. Eva brought the children to see him off. The boys skipped stones. Marta petted his horse and chattered about a foal. The baby, finally named Thomas, slept in a sling on Eva's back. Eva approached Chaska. She held out a cloth purse heavy with coins. The agent insisted I take a reward. I want you to have it. For your people. For everything. Chaska looked at the purse, then at her face. Gently, he folded her fingers back around it. You carried 5 children through a winter pass with half a town hunting you. You survived fire and cold and men with guns. Use this to build something they can't burn. Something that'll still stand when your children have children. Their hands stayed joined a moment longer than necessary. The river rushed beside them. Above, geese flew north. They released each other before anyone could see. Chaska swung into the saddle. He looked down at her. If trouble comes again, send word. I'll come. I know, Eva said quietly, because she did. He rode north. Eva watched until they disappeared. Months passed. Summer burned, autumn came with frost. Winter returned gentler than the last. On a cold morning, Eva stood in her cabin doorway watching her children. Lena helped with the younger one's face still serious, but no longer haunted. Fritz had work helping Abe with horses. Carl and Marta played with unself-conscious joy. Thomas toddled between them, laughing. A rider appeared on the road from the north. Ava's heart lifted before she recognized him. Chaska rode easy, wearing a simple beaded shirt hair in a single braid. Not a war party. Just a man visiting. He dismounted. The children swarmed him. Fritz showing off rope skills, Carl and Marta competing for attention, even Lena smiling shyly. He answered questions with patient gravity. Later, when the children were occupied, Ava and Chaska walked together toward the high pastures. They didn't hold hands, didn't touch. But they walked close enough their shadows merged, and they spoke quietly of small things of the coming winter, the health of Mungguao's people, the progress of her children. The strange peace settled over the valley. When they returned as the sun set, Chaska prepared to ride back. Will you come again? Eva asked. Yes, when I can. when it's safe?" She nodded. That was enough. More than she expected when she was running up a frozen mountain with death at her heels. The final image, a green slope above Bear Creek under sky, washed clean by rain. Chaska rode his bay at easy walk. On one side walked Eva, carrying Thomas on her hip. On the other, the older children tramped along, arguing cheerfully, the way children do when they feel safe. In the distance, Lakota teepees and settler cabins shared the valley floor. It wasn't harmony, not peace. It was an uneasy truce, built on exhaustion and memory of a man whose greed made enemies of people who should have been neighbors. But it was also a chance, and chances were all anyone got in this hard country. Chaska glanced down. Eva looked up. Their eyes met. Something passed between them, not words, not promises, but understanding. If another storm came, neither would face it alone. And in the end, in a place where winter could kill and men could be monsters, that small certainty was worth more than all the silver in the mountain.